Alright, for today's build, we're making something a little different. A full set of wooden dominoes plus a box to store them in. There's not a lot of ingredients for this one, which is nice. I'm starting with this slab of maple for the domino bodies. For the pits, those little dots, I grabbed a bunch of 1/4 inch walnut dowels from Amazon. And for the dividing line across each domino, I'm using some leftover Padauk I had laying around. This maple board measures about 3 inches by 17 inches and roughly an inch thick. The plan is to rip it in half, then cut each down the middle again, which should give me 4 strips. Once everything's cleaned up, the dominoes will finish at about 1.25 inches by 2.5 and 3/8 inch thick. Just to double check everything, I traced a few dowel circles onto the board as a test mock-up. Everything looked good, so it's over to get this off. After ripping down the board to width, I needed to slice each piece thinner. For safety, I made the cuts in multiple passes, dropped the blade, cut, raised the blade, repeat. Once I reach halfway, I flip the board and finish the cut from the other side. Slow, steady, no drama. This process worked great, but it definitely left some burn marks on the maple. But nothing a quick trip through the planer couldn't fix. This both cleans up the burn marks and also makes sure that I have consistent thickness for each of my dominoes. Okay, next up we got to start thinking about the inlay or the bar that's going to run across the dominoes. I started off by finding the exact center of each strip, then headed back to the table saw to cut the shallow groove, about halfway through the board. I'm going to lower my blade to cut about halfway through this piece, and then bring in the fence to match the center mark on the boards. I know the thickness of my saw blade is 1/8 of an inch thick, so I'll cut a couple strips of Padauk to match. Now, theoretically, these should snap right into place. Perfect. A little bit of glue, press the strips into place, and suddenly we have this bright red line running through the maple. Looks pretty awesome already. Okay, now for the little dots, the pits. I need a lot of these. To make life a little easier, I started off by taping these dowels into one solid block so they wouldn't bounce all over the place while cutting. Then, I used my sled at the table saw to slice them into little discs. Nothing too scientific here, they're about 1/4 of an inch or so thick, and that'll give me plenty. With the maple and Padauk strips dry, it was time to turn these into actual dominoes. For this, I stayed at the sled and used a stop block set to 1 1/4 inches. Quick cuts, nice rhythm, and I ended up with 56 domino blocks. Now, I had to do a little research here because I know nothing about dominoes, but for context, a standard double 6 set has 28 pieces. Domino sets go all the way up to double 18, which is 190 pieces, and that is a lot of holes to drill, and I'm not really interested in doing that. So with my 56, I decided to make 2 double 6 sets. Using an online template as a guide, I sketched out the pit pattern on each of these pieces. To drill the pits perfectly safely and consistently, I put together a really simple jig. Nothing fancy, just some leftover wood scraps glued into a piece of plywood. Not only does it keep the dominoes aligned, but it keeps my fingers nowhere near that spinning bit. I also drilled 9 evenly spaced holes into a scrap board that matched the size of my domino. Any spot that a pit could go, I drilled a hole, and used that as a marking template to help keep everything lined. Then it was over to the drill press. I used a 1/4 inch Forstner bit, set the depth stop to about halfway through the thickness, lined up the marks, and just dropped down the bit. Super clean holes, and if you're counting, it's 336 of them. Once the holes were drilled, it was time to glue in all the walnut dots. Nothing fancy, just dip a dowel in some glue and drop it into place. I could tell here that something was a little bit off. I was expecting a much tighter fit, so either the dowels were a hair undersized or the Forstner bit was a hair oversized, but either way, it left a little gap around some of the pits, which I figured I'd have to come back to fix later on. Once the glue had a little time to dry, there was a quick pass of the disc sander with 80 grit, and that flattened everything really nicely. With everything dried and flattened out, you could really see the gaps in some of these dominoes. To fix that, I mixed a little glue with some walnut sawdust and packed it into the gaps with this popsicle stick. Once that dried, there was one more quick pass over at the sander, and everything blended pretty cleanly. All right, with the dominoes done, it is now time to think about storage. For that, I'm going to build a really simple box. Here's my stack of dominoes, and my goal is to build a clean little box around them. For the sides, I'm using walnut, and for the top and back, this 1/8 inch sheet of birch plywood. I'll start by milling the walnut down to the thickness that I want, same way I did with the dominoes. Then I'll rip a couple of 1/8 inch dados along the top and bottom edges. These grooves are what the plywood is going to sit in to be held into place. After that, it's just a matter of cutting a bunch of 45-degree corners and sizing everything so that it wraps neatly around the dominoes. Here you can see the box broken down into 6 pieces. Everything basically snaps together at this point. Once I'm sure that everything fits, a quick sanding on the walnut and just a touch on the plywood helps it slide smoothly into those dados. Then it's a little glue on the end caps and this box is assembled. Now, if you're starting to wonder how you're going to actually get the dominoes into place, I'll show you. Once the glue dries, we cut it open. I went about 2/3 of the way, and that gives me a little bit of a taller base and a shorter lid. A little bit of hand sanding to soften the corners, and this thing's looking really nice. Except I messed up just a little. I measured for the height of the dominoes, but forgot to factor in the width of the saw blade and the amount of material that's going to remove. So the dominoes sit just a hair too tall, and the lid no longer touches the base, which isn't ideal. This actually may have been a little bit of a happy accident. I've got some leftover Padauk strips milled down to 1/8 of an inch already, which fit just perfect. I'll make a few 45-degree cuts, a little bit of glue, some clamps, and this trim makes up for all that lost material. Honestly, the red accent looks pretty awesome. It matches the dominoes. End of the day, I'll take it as a win. Okay, next up, we got to think about how we're going to keep this lid in place. I could have used hinges, but I don't have much material to work with here. Instead, I'm going to try magnets. I'm using the same 1/4-inch Fastener bit to drill holes at each of the corners of the base and dropping a magnet into place. I drilled the hole deep enough so that 2 magnets could fit. The second magnet will get glued directly to the lid, and those aren't countersunk, so the lid nests down into the base and stays put. Really simple, really clean, and really satisfying. Finally, the finish. I'm using tung oil and brushing it on with a foam tip brush. Let it soak in, wipe off the excess with a clean cloth, and that's it. Project's done. This one ran the whole gauntlet. Frustrating in spots, pun very much intended, tedious in others, and definitely a bit more involved than I expected, but that's the nature of a build like this. You move from moment to moment, you nudge each piece into place, you deal with the surprises, and try to keep the line as steady as you can. It's kind of like setting up a long run of dominoes. You spend all that time adjusting the angles, the spacing, and then finally, you get to watch it all come together in one grand finish. And sure, you can buy a full set of dominoes for $10, and you know what? They're flawless. They're uniform, they come in this tidy little case, but the heart of handmade projects isn't in the flawlessness. It's in the small variations. It's in the marks of the process, the quirks of real work done by real hands. And for me, that's what makes it worth making. Thanks for hanging out with me in this one. I really appreciate you watching, and if you enjoyed the build, feel free to hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel and lets me keep making projects like this. See you next time.